What is next for IT modernization and digital transformation within the U.S. federal government? How is federal IT and technology improving the customer experience? I'll explore these questions and so much more with our very special guest, Maria Roat, Deputy Federal Chief Information Officer within the Office of Management and Budget. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about your duties and responsibilities, and more importantly, where does it fit within OMB?
So I am, the Deputy Federal CIO. Within OMB, we are in the Office of E-Government, which is actually the Office of the Federal CIO, who is currently Claire Montana's the Federal CIO. But our portfolio really covers the entire broad brush of anything touching technology and cybersecurity across the federal government. This is really where we sit. And when you think about technology and how it touches and underlines and enables so much across the federal government, we really have a hand in touching many things. So my portfolio really is advising, of course, the federal CIO on just general information technology oversight, as well as, the OMB director, deputy director, and others. And then just overseeing the operational and those administrative functions on IT policy development, agency engagement, just governance, and overall IT modernization and digital service delivery, right? And data governance. All of those things really come into the scope of responsibilities. The portfolio is very broad, dealing with not only internal stakeholders within OMB, including on the budget side, right? Working on the budget, whether it's, this year's, next year's, the out years, as well as working with all of the CIOs through the CIO councils and the CISO councils. So it's a very big, very broad portfolio, and we touch many things.
What are some of the top challenges you have faced since taking on your position at OMB, whether it was in the acting capacity or now as Deputy Federal CIO, and how have you sought to address those challenges?
Really, there is so much coordination across so many stakeholders, both internal to OMB from, in other offices within the EOP, including the NSC, the Office of Science and Technology Programs, just across the board within not just OMB and the budget, but also external across the federal agencies, and as well as working with industry and other stakeholders. I think when you look at all of those factors and how that comes together, I think, the long-term planning is something that we really pay attention to, because think about this year, we're in FY21. The FY22 budget is already, on its way. We're already working on FY23 and thinking about FY24. So I think when you think about in terms of challenges to your question, it's really being able to think strategically and how you can move the needle for the federal government, thinking in the long term, knowing that the budget drives a lot of this, and how do you get what you need into the budget to support technology in the federal government? So you really have to have that long view for the long-term planning.
A modern information technology, IT, functions as the backbone of how government serves the public in a digital age. That's pretty obvious. But I was wondering, Maria, what are the key IT priorities being pursued by the current administration?
So we really have an eye towards improving customer experience. Having that vision for a federal enterprise, cross-government initiatives, and really running IT like a business. When having that vision of a seamless government, right? You want to harness technology to stay nimble, resilient, secure. And this is really when you're looking at the priorities of the administration, as well as the federal CIO, getting in the weeds on a couple of the areas is really looking at that customer experience, how you design and build for your customers, for the people, right? You build services and offering using human-centered design to provide users a better experience. And there's been, some legislation over time, over the last few years, whether it's the IDEA Act and the CASES Act. There are two areas that are foundationally, they are really impactful for better user experiences. And as we look at our customers, it's just not the public and our external customers, but also our internal federal employees as well. And I think this is one area that's incredibly important to the CIO Council, looking at how we improve that customer experience across, whether it's for our internal or our external customers. I will also share, when we talk about Federal Enterprise Project, the CIO Council is leading a project on cross-government collaboration and interconnectivity capabilities. So this is for email, calendaring, text chat, document sharing, and collaboration, as well as video conferencing and large file sharing. We have a number of agencies that are up on online in a pilot right now, and we're looking to scale that and roll that out. Because through the pandemic, we recognized, and from the CIO Council, that it was critically important that we share across the federal government, not just vertically within agencies, but across the federal government, and be able to engage with the states as well. We know that, 21st century technology, right? Making sure that we have modern technology for both our public and for the public services. And this is really, I think, where the ARP TMF 1 billion comes in, the shared services to address legacy and enable the federal government to grow, not just run, but grow and transform. On the priorities, I also think being secure by design, right? Building security, and cybersecurity is front and center. You saw the cyber executive order. It's accelerating. There's 40 accelerating the federal government, maturity for the federal government. There's 44 actions for OMB for federal-wide initiatives. 44 for OMB. And this is really a big push to bring up the entire federal government on cybersecurity. And of course, data continues to be an area of focus, as well as the workforce. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention another area is really about IT portfolio management. The council took on a project last year to revisit our investment management and really think about how we manage our IT portfolio in its entirety.
Could you tell us more about the Technology Modernization Fund, TMF, and what's the mission, principles, and how has it benefited federal agencies in the drive toward IT modernization?
Yeah, so the TMF has been around. It came out of the MGT Act, and the actual Technology Modernization Fund, the board stood up in March 3 years ago. And it's really that innovative funding vehicle, right? It gives agencies ways to deliver services to the public more quickly, better secure systems, data, use taxpayer dollars just more efficiently, right? And it's really prioritizing those solutions to improve delivery, right? Is there modernization that needs to happen within an agency, consolidation of services, and really prioritizing those projects that serve as common solution or reuse across the federal government. For every project that we've had over the last 3 years, everyone's had to develop a playbook on what they've done and lessons learned so it could be shared out with other agencies. When you look at HUD on their mainframe modernization, that was a huge multi-year lift, but they learned a lot coming out of that. And part of that is that reuse and being able to share those lessons learned with other agencies. With the $1 billion in the ARP, we're looking at projects that cut across the agencies, of course, really those enterprise-wide projects, those things that have immediate security gaps, right? How do those things that need addressed, and really any others that improves the public's availability to access government services. So, as we're getting projects in, we've got proposals coming in that are modernizing some of those high priority systems across the federal government, because they do have significant impact, whether it's just on the public and how we serve our public, or longstanding security issues. And I keep coming back to cybersecurity because this is really bringing the federal government up to a consistent baseline of maturity, bringing everybody up in cybersecurity, privacy, and really addressing those gaps that I mentioned earlier about, that we're trying to resolve through the executive order. Also with, public facing digital services, scalable services, as we look at proposals, we look at those in mind for what are those cross-cutting across the federal government initiatives, not just a component or a bureau within an agency or department, but those cross-cutting. So we've really looked at over 100 proposals now. we've received over 100 proposals, and we're continuing to review those. The breadth of what's come in is really pretty significant, and we're reviewing those, methodically reviewing and awarding those. As far as awarding funding, we've got quite a few that have gone through the initial project proposals, moving through to the FPP stage, right? Making your pitch and why you should get funding for this. We received a lot of proposals because of the repayment flexibility. With the first round, the last 3 years, there was 100% payback required. The board does have flexibility with this go around. So I think it is very beneficial where you do have to address cybersecurity gaps, where there is no demonstrable, if you will, payback, because you do have to make that investment, and there is no one for one or like payback model on that. So when the board did recognize that initially, and then with this repayment with the TMF, it's really giving us the flexibility.
Maria, is there anything else happening in terms of how the program is changing a little bit, given the fact that it was a recent $1 billion funding to TMF? I think it was that was the right amount. Is there any changes to governance, tracking of the process? Are there any ready to go projects? I know you alluded to 100 that you received. Is there anything else you want to add and how things are going to change because of the wealth of funding?
Yeah, I think the groundwork we laid over the last 3 years, it's really allowing the board and the PMO to just adjust, and we've been able to scale quickly. We are meeting twice a week. We added some alternate board members to help with the reviews. But we still have to maintain that quality governance and the rigor, right? That made all of our prior awards very successful, right? We've increased capacity, scaled the PMO, we're accelerating the reviews. We're meeting twice a week. We did do that early on 3 years ago when we got our first proposals in, but we're back to meeting twice a week on that. But as expected, we are seeing large scale modernization and cybersecurity projects. But we've received a little over 100 proposals. The board is actively reviewing. I think we've done over 30 reviews to date, and we've got more than 15, close to 20 that we've advanced to the full project proposal phase. So we are excited about hearing from the agencies, not just the CIOs, but those mission stakeholders, the CFO and others, as they make their pitch for the money. So it's pretty exciting.
Switch gears a little bit towards the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic on federal IT operations. How has it impacted IT operations, from how the agencies operate and work to how they deliver on various missions? And if you may, what ways, if any, has the pandemic accelerated the push towards modernization and transformation? What I'm getting at is like electronic signatures, telework, robotic process engineering.
It's a great, I think I'm going to answer the second part first. When you go back a year and a half ago with everyone flipping to telework, the government flipped over pretty seamlessly to telework, 100% telework. Yet at the same time, electronic signatures, the use of electronic signatures and getting off of paper, that really accelerated. I saw that firsthand, right? No more moving paper around, or because you didn't have the ability to print something at home and sign something and scan it. And I was very heartened because I've always used electronic signatures where I can, right? Save a tree and not print out as much. I was really happy to see a lot of those simple processes. And even though I say simple, it was impactful to move to electronic signature because things moved a lot faster through rather than shuffling paper around and printing and things like that. But also, I think the pandemic really accelerated and really showed what we could do when we got bureaucracy out of the way. Everyone was very focused on a thing, whether it was the CARES Act or any of the other subsequent legislation that came out. Everything was very focused on execution, and we have to execute. There was pressure to meet deadlines, timelines, all of those things. So we saw where agency moved a lot of their projects because they got infused with funding. They were able to move projects that were, a year, 18 months, 2 months out, and move them way to the left and execute on those. So that's how modernization was accelerated, because we got the bureaucracy out of the way. I think we also saw where we used data so much for the response efforts. But I'd like to see, as we continue for the federal government to continue to accelerate, because we showed how much we could do when we got those blockers out of the way, that sense of urgency. How do we keep that and how do we maintain that? I think that's a challenge, so that we don't go back to the same old, and we maintain that sense of urgency. So we continue to push and drive modernization. And even as I talked about earlier, looking at the budget cycles, but how do we keep that sense of urgency and continuing to push and infuse that into the budget cycles, even as we're looking at 23 and 24?
What are some of the key cybersecurity challenges facing the U.S. federal government? How are you working to address those challenges and mitigate the risk and impact of the threats to federal agencies' data, systems, and networks?
The government's response to SolarWinds and some of the other major incidents, it really identified, federal networks. There are gaps in some of our fundamental and foundational cybersecurity measures and some of the things that we do. Some agencies are certainly, their maturity is way ahead of others. But again, it did identify some of those foundational cybersecurity challenges that we have across the federal government. In addition to the executive order and all the actions in there, we're also engaging in efforts to incrementally transition FISMA from that compliance-based model to a risk-based model, right? With a focus on empirical data, defenses, reducing the attack surface, and having very clear security outcomes from that. So we're not just about compliance. So taking a step back, aside from the executive order and all the actionable things in there, from a strategy perspective, looking at FISMA and that compliance model that we have, and how do we adjust that, and then align agency strategic goals, right, for those fundamental cybersecurity improvements for FISMA, as well as the president's management agenda, and continuing to drive that change. We have to streamline those requirements, whether it's qualitative, quantitative, performance reporting, as we're bringing up the maturity of the federal government to address those gaps. And we have to make sure that as we're looking at reporting, not just compliance, but again, to quantify those gaps, figure out what those big barriers are to, achieving, call it success, right? Achieving and addressing those foundational things. So this is where FISMA comes in, really those assessments, those metrics, and how do we augment that? And how do we continue to build on that from a strategy perspective, so that we're moving away from those compliance exercises to really more of looking at it with that risk lens, and a risk-based model, with using data and empirical data to understand clearly where we are to address those foundational gaps.
Maria, are there any complementary strategies that can magnify the impact of IT modernization?
From a strategy perspective, I think, the TMF, the ARP funding, and the $1 billion there. I know the administration had wanted more money than that. I think I saw a number at one point, like 10 billion. But part of that, there's a number of strategies. One is that TMF and the ARP funds, right? That is impacting IT modernization in the federal government, providing those funds with the flexibility around repayment, where agencies have not been able to fund multi-year initiatives in our current budgeting environment. where it's very hard to plan, at least from a CIO perspective, and speaking from experience, how do you plan year after year for multi-year initiatives? And the TMF is really one strategy that is impacting that. I think cybersecurity, looking at it also from a multi-year perspective with the cyber EO, the zero trust framework, and the architectures that the agencies have to put forward, that is a second thread that is really driving IT modernization. Because if you look at the high impact service providers, some of the technology that's behind the scenes, some of that continues to be dated. So by driving cybersecurity, a zero trust architecture, by default, you have to tackle a lot of these systems. So these are two strategies that are very impactful and that are really going to drive change across the federal government and in landscape at large.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with Maria Roat, Deputy Federal Chief Information Officer within the Office of Management and Budget. Subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Podcast One, iTunes, or on your favorite podcast app. And as always at businessofgovernment.org.